Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
A note to listeners. The following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
I mean, he wouldn't seem to have the same personality traits as a lot of the serial killers, but the more we looked into it, the more we found that he actually did have some of them. The idea of leading up to it, the hunt, if you will, which was so important to other people you've studied, like BTK, for instance, that wasn't important to David Berkowitz. What was important to him was the act itself, the release of the bullet, if you will, from this heavy 44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog handgun, which gave him a sense of power.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman.
Welcome back to The Killing Hour with Doc Bonn. Looking back on the life of David Berkowitz, it is difficult to believe that this unassuming postal worker turned into the son of Sam, one of the world's most notorious serial killers. And it all starts with the mind.
It's only been since the late 70s that law enforcement started to actually understand why people become serial killers and what makes them tick.
Today, we're glad to have back on the podcast Mark OLSHAKER, co-author of MINDHUNTER, to help us get inside the mind of Son of Sam. It's time to start The Killing Hour with Doc Bonn.
All right, so once again, we have Mark OLSHAKER with us to dive into Son of Sam. You know, he was helping us talk about BTK, and we're pleased to have him on today to help us kind of navigate David Berkowitz and Son of Sam. So, Mark, thank you for being on.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
And so, Scott, why don't you start off and kind of, you know, you're the resident expert here as well, as far as Son of Sam, having spent time talking with him and meeting with him in person. So why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Well, once again, thank you, Mark, for joining us. I know that you and your partner, John Douglas, spent quite a bit of time researching and writing about Son of Sam. Just to start things off, what can you tell us about that experience overall?
Well, it was fascinating, as so many of the serial killers are. And one of the things that was really important to us was to understand his motive and also understand his modus operandi. I mean, he wouldn't seem to have the same personality traits as a lot of the serial killers, but the more we looked into it, the more we found that he actually did have some of them.
That's interesting because other people have said that too, about how in the beginning they didn't think that he had those traits. What was it, in your opinion, in the beginning about him that was a little different than other serial killers?
Well, normally we think of predatory serial killers as being at least somewhat sexually motivated. I mean, a lot of them, as Scott has often said, are sexual sadists. Almost all of the rest are sociopathic or psychopathic in one degree or another. This was a guy who was killing people without getting up close and personal. He didn't touch his victims. He didn't try to rape or sexually assault any of the women. He didn't keep souvenirs. And yet, when we looked into it, and when John and Robert Ressler interviewed him at Attica Prison in New York, they found that really what he was doing was sexually based. The power of being able to control these lives, of being able to possess these women, if you will, through this heavy handgun he used, was sexually motivated. And what he told John and Bob, when he couldn't find another victim of opportunity or couldn't get out to do it, he would go back to some of the scenes that he had killed people in the past and he would symbolically roll in the mud, if you will, and then he'd go back home thinking about it with that image fixed in his mind and masturbate. And this fit in with some of his earlier antisocial activity, which was fire starting. He started well over 1,000 small fires in the New York City area, and then as soon as the fire started, he would masturbate. And then when the fire department came and he saw the tremendous power that he had to do this, he would masturbate again, which is actually not that unusual for serial arsonists.
That's absolutely true. And even in his correspondence, Joe Borelli, the captain of the NYPD that was the task force that was going after him, and in his correspondence with Jimmy Breslin, he was attempting to terrorize the city. So, that instilling fear and a sense of power, I think, was very, very important to the entire process. Something else that occurs to me is, you mentioned that he was rather impersonal in terms of his killing, the using the gun, when oftentimes they're stranglers or they use a knife very up close and personal. It strikes me that there's two kinds of serial killers. There's one who are focused on the act of killing, and then others who are focused on the process, meaning the things leading up to it and torture and so forth. I think he was very much focused on the symbolic nature of the act, the killing itself. What are your thoughts on that?
No question about it, Scott. He definitely was. And then the aftermath, the idea of leading up to it, the hunt, if you will, which was so important to other people you've studied, like BTK, for instance, that wasn't important to David Berkowitz. What was important to him was the act itself, the release of the bullet, if you will, from this heavy 44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog handgun, which gave him a sense of power that he had in no other part of his life. He was an insignificant postal worker who'd been adopted as a child, and whose birth mother rejected him when he went back to find her, even though she had raised his biological sister. So this is a guy who had a lot of resentment. He was not comfortable around women. I believe our research showed that his first actual sexual experience was in Korea when he was in the military, and he got venereal disease from the experience. So he was not a real winner with women, and I think he wanted to get back to them and back at them. And I think what's so very significant, Scott, is as he approached each of these cars in which he would try to kill the occupants, it was not the male side that he went to, the threats, what we would normally consider the greater threat side. It was the women's side that he would go to. That was his target. The man was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and had to be dispatched too.
This is a question I have for both of you guys. Mark, when John Douglas, did he ever say when he went and met him, when he saw him in prison, did he say why he chose the gun he chose and why he didn't do it another way?
I think the idea was he wanted a big, strong, powerful weapon, and this 44 caliber handgun was one. I don't know why he chose that particular Charter Arms brand. It may be what he could get, but it was the gun itself that gave him the power. And I would say, in a lot of cases, Scott's the psychologist, so he can probably speak to this better than I can, but I think in a lot of cases, a handgun or even a long gun is an extension of sexual power for a lot of these guys.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I don't know that Berkowitz has ever said specifically why he used a gun and that particular type of gun, but I think we can certainly draw some conclusions from it. It's extremely powerful. It's very loud. It's a heavy gun, and so I think that there are definitely sexual implications there. But it's also a further indication, as Mark said, that it was the finality was the killing. That's the thing that he really wanted, and I totally agree that he felt insignificant, that he was looking for meaning and some kind of purpose, and he thought that he would attain it through killing. And I do believe, part of the Son of Sam legend is that he was doing it for Satan, and that his next door neighbor, Sam Carr, was a demon or Satan himself telling him to kill through the barking of that dog, Harvey, the Labrador. But that brings me to a broader question, Mark. In your mind, do you think that Berkowitz was mentally ill?
Well, that's an interesting question, Scott, which again you and I could probably debate endlessly from your background of knowledge. I I would suggest and submit to you that anybody who kills in cold blood an innocent victim like that, yes, is mentally ill to one degree or another. The question to me always goes back to the original test of English common law of the McNaughton rule, which is the person incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong and incapable of conforming his behavior to the dictates and restrictions of society. And under that framework, I would say no, he was certainly mentally ill, but he was not what we would say legally insane or out of his mind. And I think we may have mentioned this in previous conversations, Scott, but we use the, I guess you would call it the imaginary test of the policeman at the elbow, which says if there was a uniformed police officer in the vicinity and watching what was going on, would the crime have been committed? And if you say yes, the offender would still have committed the crime, even with a uniformed policeman watching, then that person is probably certifiably insane. Mm-hmm. If he would conform his behavior and not do that, then that person certainly has the self-control not to commit the crime, but chooses to anyway. And that's what people don't seem to understand, that you can be mentally ill and still control yourself, and you can understand the difference between right and wrong, but just not care. I mean, Scott, you've done a lot of work on antisocial personality types, borderline personality disorder types, people who just don't have any sense of empathy or projection into another person. And that's what we're talking about here.
Yes, absolutely. I totally concur with that, Mark. The legal bar for temporary insanity is so high that almost no serial killer can actually use the insanity defense, because they do know right from wrong. They do know that thou shalt not kill, but they just don't care. They absolutely don't care.
I think the only serial killer that I can think of off the top of my head who I think really would fit the definition of actual legal insanity was Richard Trenton Chase, who believed that he had to drink the blood of young women to stay alive. And even after he was caught, sentenced, and put in prison, he would still kill birds and mice or rats, whatever he could find, so that he could drink their blood before he finally committed suicide in prison. So that's somebody who I would say, yeah, that guy is really off his nut. But most of them do what they do because it's still the most satisfying thing in their lives.
I have a question, and I know a lot of our audience has asked me this question in the past about serial killers. For David Berkowitz, he had a difficult relationship with his mother. He was adopted and then rejected by her. I understand that there was a culmination of events that led to his killing, but was there one event that you feel was the trigger point for him from going from being a postal worker who was dejected and had difficulty with women to becoming a serial killer that terrorized New York City? I mean,
well, first of all, you have to consider that people don't just suddenly emerge as serial killers; they evolve. And David Berkowitz evolved from abusing small animals as a child, and then starting fires, and then starting larger fires. And I would say when he finally blossoms into a serial killer, it's first of all the combination of getting venereal disease from the prostitute in the military in his first sexual encounter, which I would submit to you probably changed his view of women to begin with. And then I think what really did it, from my understanding, was the rejection by his birth mother to accepting him, even though she had accepted and raised his biological sister. And I think that's when he blossoms into a serial killer, when he decides that he is going to get back at women in general, and he's also going to take them away from the people who are luckier than him to have women in their lives. I don't know if Scott agrees with that.
Yeah, Scott, did he say anything about that when you talked to him?
No, he did. To answer your question, Rob, he did. And I think that Mark is right about the, perhaps reaching the tipping point with the anger and frustration and rejection that he felt. But this was within a larger personality issue that he had struggled with his whole life. That was, he had no meaning. He had no purpose, no sense of self-worth. And he went into the Army, and he told me this when I met with him and interviewed him, that he was hoping that the Army would give him some sort of purpose. But the experience with the prostitute and the fact that he was not in Vietnam, he thought he would be a soldier and he would kill for the country and he would find meaning and purpose. Well, he didn't. He wasn't sent to Vietnam. And he said he came home more lonely and desperate and unfulfilled than ever. And that's when he began dabbling in Satanism and the occult. And he said he began to feel something there that inspired him. And in his delusions, in his pathology, his mental pathology, he came to believe somehow over time, that over a period really of a couple of years, that if he killed for Satan, that he would somehow find this purpose that he had been lacking in his entire life. And so I think it was the life events, the rejections that we've talked about, on top of this fact that he was just struggling for some sort of meaning and purpose in general, trying to fill up a hole inside of him, if you will. And that's what ultimately took him over the edge. And the reason that he killed again and again, and he made this very clear to me, is each time that he killed, he thought he would be rewarded by this, again, having a sense of satisfaction that Satan would reward him somehow, but it never happened. He felt more let down than ever. It was the letdown after the high of the killing, and he was driven to kill again and again and again.
So I guess you would say that was his primary motive for the killing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think so. And also, once he started getting notoriety, once he became known as the 44 caliber killer who was terrorizing New York between 1976 and 1977, and then when he writes the letter to Joe Borelli, the detective captain in New York, in the New York Police Department, and he gives himself essentially the name Son of Sam. Then he's a celebrity, and he's got the power that he never had before, and he's really reveling in it. And so the more letters he writes to Borelli again, to Jimmy Breslin, as Scott said, he's enhancing his myth and building on it each time he opens his mouth, essentially.
That's right. And he told me in no uncertain terms that he got great satisfaction from knowing that he had the entire city of New York, the greatest city in the world, at a standstill, and the tremendous sense of power and strength and satisfaction that gave him. So that was, in a way, it was giving him the fulfillment that he was looking for. So
Absolutely.
He of course he relished in it. I firmly believe, there's so many different legends about the Son of Sam. He's become mythical, in our popular culture, and I believe that the Labrador Retriever, Harvey, Sam Carr being Satan and all that, I really believe that a lot of that was just made up. I think that Berkowitz was killing for this greater good as he saw it, for Satan, and trying to achieve some sense of fulfillment. But a lot of the details and a lot of the rest of it, I think, is just pure mythology, and I think a lot of it he made up just to terrorize people. I don't know. I
completely agree, and I think if you look at the original letter and see all the misspellings in it and the improper grammar and all of that, you see that this is just a guy who is making it up as he went along. And, he had dabbled in Satanism, as you say, and so the idea that this was a 2,000-year-old talking dog who was telling him what to do, and that Sam Carr himself was Satan, this all fit into a nice framework with him, when in fact what he wanted to get back at society. He wanted to get back at women. He thought somehow in his twisted mind that by killing these women he could possess them, and he may have even had some sense that he could possess them on a spiritual level. And I understand, since he's been in prison, he's now born again Christian, so obviously some other form of spiritualism has taken hold with him, as it often does with people who are in prison for the rest of their lives. So there you have it. John finally said, I don't know if we can say this on radio, and if not, you'll have to cut it out, but John said to him, all right, David, let's cut the bullshit. what about the dog, and what about Sam Carr being the devil and all that? And Berkowitz just smiled and just kind of shrugged.
So it sounds like he was creating his own narrative for his legend.
No question about it. Yeah, as most of these guys do. I mean, as Scott can tell you from studying BTK, when Dennis Rader was committing all of his crimes, and he was the opposite of Berkowitz. I mean, the hunt was what was important to him, deciding on his victims, planning out the crimes. That was all very important to him, as it wasn't to Berkowitz. But when Dennis Rader starts communicating with the media and the police, he's resentful that he doesn't have a cool name like Son of Sam, and he specifically says so. And that's why he came up with BTK. He wanted just as much notoriety.
Where did the name Son of Sam even come from?
I think that, as I recall from the original letter, which I can probably lay my hands on, but he believed that he and all of his devilish friends were a part of the Devil Sam's progeny.
Well, I can.
Did he have other friends that because they say as far as
I meant that in a metaphor.
Okay, got it. I was going to say because in order to be part of a cult, there has to be more than one person, and that was the other thing that we were talking about.
He was not part of a cult.
I know.
As far as I can tell.
Yeah, because that's the whole thing with the Netflix documentary that has been out recently and talking about the cult of Son of Sam, and it's been.
In fact, he refers in the letter that he wrote to Joe Borelli, as he says, "I am the Son of Sam," and he says, "Go out and kill," commands Father Sam, and then he calls him Pap Sam and Papa Sam, and he says Papa Sam is old now; he needs some blood to preserve his youth, and so this is typical of the kind of nonsensical mythology that these guys set up around themselves.
I think he was very aware of what he was doing. I mean, he gave himself his own brand name.
Yes.
Son of Sam and Jack the Ripper and the Boston Strangler. I mean, these are brand names that stand the test of time. He knew that he was putting himself on a public stage and giving himself personality and an identity that he was lacking in his own life.
That's very, very true. And when John and Bob Ressler went in to interview him at Attica, John brought some of the newspaper clippings from the coverage, and he said, "David, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when everybody has forgotten John Douglas or Bob Ressler, because of what you've done, they're still going to remember the Son of Sam and the way you terrorized New York City." And at that point, Berkowitz, who'd had a very low affect up until that point, really perked up, and it was like, okay, now we're really talking about me. That's great. Let's go on. And that's when he started opening up. And we can also overdetermine a lot of these things. I believe on one of the letters, at least one of the letters, there was this sort of very elaborate border that he had drawn around the letter. John asked him at one point, "Well, what does this signify?" And he said, "I just thought it looked nice."
Yeah, yeah. He was doodling.
No, is that what it was? Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I would think that that brings me out, Scott. For when you were up there and met him, did he kind of because when you went up there, was he a born again Christian when you met him at that time?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That's been going on for quite a while.
Okay, so
that goes back to I think 86 or 87.
Okay, so when you started interviewing him and asking him questions, was he still kind of reveling in his fame, in his infamy?
No, he is very different today, and in fact, it's very difficult to even get him to go on record and say anything about his killings at this point. He doesn't like to even hear the term or say the word Son of Sam. He refers to himself now as Son of Hope. He says he's been reborn and that his life is totally committed to God. So no, he has transformed himself once again. He's created an entire new identity for himself, which we can discuss and debate the likelihood that this is all true. But nevertheless, no, he presents himself in a very different way now.
Interesting. Have you ever? I mean, I know a lot of inmates and killers who are behind bars. They turn to God to find purpose because they're stuck in a 6x9 cell for the rest of their life. Is that kind of common with serial killers as well, who have no empathy most of the time and who are
No, it's in my experience, it's really not, and that's why I really don't think that David Berkowitz is a psychopath. I don't believe that he is. Someone like BTK that we've talked about, or Ted Bundy, are literally cold-blooded killers that are unable to feel remorse or any sort of empathy toward another human being. And I don't believe that is the case with David Berkowitz. I think he was a highly disturbed individual who suffered from profound emotional problems and some and mental problems, but I don't believe that underneath he's a psychopath. And
I think I would agree with that in the sense that you take somebody like Dennis Rader or some of the really violent sexual sadists like Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris or Leonard Lake and Charles Eng. These people are just really bad, evil, horrible people. Certainly David Berkowitz was very disturbed, but I think Scott and I would probably agree that if his life had gone differently, particularly in terms of the adoption, about his mother not rejecting him later on, this was not an inevitable series of killings.
I agree. I totally agree. Again, I've used the analogy with Berkowitz specifically, and more generally with serial killers, but definitely Berkowitz specifically, that what he was going through was almost like the cycle of addiction and withdrawal, not unlike a heroin addict.
Interesting.
He would reach a point where this hunger inside of him, and in his case, I think it was looking for purpose and strength and power and meaning, and he thought he would get it through killing. So he gets his high, he gets his fix, but then very soon thereafter, he comes down from that, and all he's left with is loneliness and pain again. So he has to go back once again, go through the cycle, and kill in another attempt to achieve it and maintain that high that he's never able to do. So I think that analogy of the cycle of addiction actually fits pretty well with Berkowitz's pathology.
Did he have, Scott? And maybe also Mark, from John Douglas's perspective, did he have any shame after the killings? Or because you're talking about like him having this letdown after the killing, is that a little bit of form of shame?
Yeah, well, there may be on a personal level. Generally, what you have with serial killers, and Berkowitz may be an example of this as well, is you have this deep-seated sense of inadequacy and hopelessness, which you certainly had with Berkowitz. But at the other, warring with that is this sense of entitlement or grandiosity or this need to have something meaningful, and that's all triangulated by the sense of resentment that society or women or his peers or whoever are not giving him the satisfaction, the recognition, the rewards that he deserves. And so I think the one word that I see throughout his criminal career is this need or lust for power, whether it's the fire starting, getting fire departments to come to wherever he bids them to come, whether it's killing these couples in lovers' lanes, whether it's going back to relive the scenes over and over again, or whether it's communicating with press and the police to show that he's superior to them. All this strikes me as being a power displacement scenario.
I totally agree with that. And Berkowitz, he was a very troubled, sick soul. And so I don't think that he was satisfied, that he felt fulfilled, that he felt good about what he was doing at all. I think he was very troubled, and that's why, again, that I don't think that psychopathy fits his personality. Whereas someone like Dennis Rader could go kill, torture, and destroy another human life or multiple lives, and then go back and have lunch with his wife as if nothing had happened, and he's just completely unflappable. That's a very different personality type than
yeah. The other thing the other thing I think is interesting is his method of killing. The fact that he distanced himself and he used the gun, as opposed to a lot of the serial killers got up close and personal, strangulation, stabbing.
I don't think he had that kind of confidence.
Yeah, I think so too.
And Scott, one thing I'd like to ask you: do you think that, at a certain point, not too long after he got to Attica, he was attacked, his throat was slashed, I think he needed like 50 stitches, and he almost died from that attack. Do you think that changed him at all?
Well, in fact, he bears the scar. I was sitting just a couple of feet away from him across the table, and he still has a nasty, jagged scar across his throat from that. Yes, I do believe that had an effect on him. He told me he actually, for the first couple of years that he was locked up, he still was under this delusion that Satan was somehow his benefactor, and that Satan would actually release him, that somehow he would be released from prison and set free for all the work that he had done for Satan. But over time, he came to realize not only is this not going to happen, but that he's very frail, very fragile, and that he himself is in danger in prison. And that's when he became desperate. He became completely despondent. And he said by 1986, he wanted to die. He said he probably would have killed himself if he didn't have this moment of clarity or divine intervention where he believes that he became a born-again Christian. So, yes, I think that tremendous wake-up call for him.
That makes sense.
Yes. One thing that I think if we could talk about for just another minute or so is this whole notion that he was part of a killing cult. And, that as Rob said, there was the Netflix series about that. There have been books written about it. There are people, educated people and knowledgeable people who absolutely maintain that he was part of a group, a killing group. And Berkowitz says that's absolutely not true. He told me that emphatically that he acted alone. But from the standpoint of being a serial killer, and here's where I'd like to get some of your thought, Mark, is just being part of a killing group is relatively inconsistent with being a serial killer. There have been serial killers who have had junior partners along the way,
yes,
and the Barbie and Ken killers. But generally, they're marching to a beat of a drum that only they can hear in their own head. So it's very inconsistent to have a whole group marching to that same internal drum beat.
I absolutely agree with that, and I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I wrote a book called The Killer's Shadow about Joseph Paul Franklin, who was one of the few serial killers we can think of who actually killed for what he considered political aims, to kill black people, Jews, and mixed-race couples. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a member of the National States Rights Party, the American Nazi Party, all kinds of right-wing nut places. And he left them all eventually because he said they were all talk. He was action. And so that's how he became a lone wolf and carried out his own mission. He hoped to inspire others, which unfortunately he did, but he was definitely a lone wolf. And on the idea of these Satanist cults, I've done a lot of study on this, and I've had many long conversations with Kenneth Lanning, the FBI special agent at Quantico, who really examined and explored for years and years the whole satanic panic cult of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And the FBI has been able to find not a single example in all the thousands of cases that have been presented to him and to them, supposedly about these cult killings. There's nothing to it. Yes, people can say they're Satan and they can draw a pentagram at the site, but we've got just as many people who leave an Old Testament or a New Testament at a crime scene and claim that they're part of a cult, and of course they're not. And in fact, even, the whole QAnon thing that's going on now with the whole left-wing cabal that's stealing children and drinking their blood and sending them overseas into sex trafficking. As you know, I live in Washington, D.C., and one of the supposed sites was an uptown pizza restaurant called Comet Ping Pong, where, if you remember, a gunman went in to rescue the children who were being trafficked in the basement. Now, the interesting thing about that, aside from the absurdity of the whole thing, is that entire block along Connecticut Avenue, there are no basements. I mean,
Yeah.
So I don't know where this came from, but, and of course, I can say there's no basements, but...
Well, I think, Mark, you touched on something...
Would say, well, you just couldn't find them. You don't know where the secret door is.
Yeah, I think you touched on something which is interesting, because during the mid-'70s, there was pop culture, there was a ton of devil movies. You had The Exorcist, you had Rosemary's Baby, you had Devil's Reign. There was a fascination, pop culture-wise, with the devil. And does that play part of that in his narrative, creating this narrative?
Oh, I think anything in pop culture could certainly do that. I mean, I think, for instance, the ransom note in the John Benet Ramsey case, which has caused so much analysis and consternation, and I've heard so many different interpretations of it. When I looked at it originally, I said, and I'm not the only one, I said, these are all pop culture movie references throughout here. So, I think, I'm sure that had a lot to do with it.
And again, we know, and he told me specifically that he desperately was trying to find some sort of meaning or purpose in his life at that time.
Sure.
And so therefore, anything that he was exposed to in pop culture could have resonated and could have planted a seed with him.
Scott, when you were up there talking to Born Again Son of Sam, does the community, the Christian community, have they embraced him, or how do you deal with that when you got the devil who flips the switch and says he's on the other side? How does that work?
Well, it's a great question, and I definitely would like to get Mark's thoughts on this as well.
Well, I think redemption is a powerful narrative in a lot of religious circles.
There's the real side of it, and then there is what are his hidden agendas or
of course,
possible motivations. So on the one hand, I will tell you this. So I'm sitting at a table in the cafeteria across from one of the most legendary killers of the 20th century. This man looks like a backyard gnome now. He's smiling. He's jovial. He's laughing. He insisted that we pray together before we had lunch. We actually had hamburgers together there in the cafeteria. And he doesn't come across as anything like the sullen young man that we remember from the 70s. And in fact, a lot of the younger prisoners are not even really aware of who he is. And they walk by the table and they say, "Brother Dave, how are you, Brother Dave?" And he says hi back to them. And so his life now, his day-to-day reality in prison, he is a spiritual guide for many men in prison who are looking for their own spiritual journey. He does work as a mobility guide. For example, there are a number of prisoners, have physical issues and impairments and so forth, and so he'll take them to the chapel or to the cafeteria or whatever, and he is seen by the staff and by his fellow inmates as something of a do-gooder, and he corresponds, believe it or not, with literally hundreds and probably thousands of people around the world who now believe that he is some sort of almost a disciple, that he somehow represents redemption. He has become a living, breathing symbol of redemption for the evangelical Christian community.
Which also gives him a sense of the importance and significance and meaning that he probably didn't have in his life before. And while, look, nobody wants to be in prison, but a lot of these guys, who really can't make it on the outside, who are violent or antisocial, in a very structured environment like prison, they can do pretty well. And it sounds like he is, from what Scott's telling us.
Yeah, but one thing I wanted to find out is, as a born-again Christian, and the community has accepted him in his redemption. Has he, as a born-again Christian, reached out to the victims' families to say anything as far as, I'm sorry, I wasn't in the proper place of mind? Is there any sort of act of contrition that he has performed?
Well, the answer to that is he did, in fact, correspond with Stacy Moskowitz's mother. Stacy was his last victim. If you remember from our conversation with Jeff Kamen, who was there as a journalist in the courtroom, Berkowitz was sing-songing to himself in the courtroom, "Stacy was a whore, Stacy was a whore," to literally terrorize the family during his appearance in court. Well, afterward, and once he became born again, he actually did correspond with Stacy Moskowitz's mother, and they were supposed to have a meeting that was going to be filmed and televised for TV. But she passed away. She passed away before that ever happened.
Scott, did he ever say anything about his relationship with his adoptive parents?
Yes, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'll tell you this. Based upon my experience with David Berkowitz in prison, he is either sincere in his remorse and his religious beliefs today, or he is the Daniel Day-Lewis actor of serial killers, because he is very convincing. And he wept with me as he talked about the victims and how badly he feels and the remorse that he feels today for that. But specifically, the person that he believes that he hurt the most and he regrets is his adopted father, Nathan, who died a couple of years ago, but he lived to be 101 years old. And as he told me about Nathan, he started crying, and he said he is the one human being who stood by me no matter what until the very end. And he said, I regret the most what I did to my adopted father, Nathan. So he said I will say, as I said, he's very convincing, and he's either convinced himself and he's under his own delusions and he's convinced himself of this, or he's actually sincere and he truly believes it. But I did find it very in some ways moving and in some ways unsettling, because he was very different in demeanor than what I might have expected.
I think he's probably found a life that works for him now. He knows that his whole world is now this prison and whatever correspondence he has with the outside world, and so he's kind of worked that into something that makes sense to him and gives him probably a meaning and an influence that he didn't feel as an anonymous postal worker who couldn't get girls.
Yes. I mean, it's, serenity and peace are difficult things to fake and mimic, and he exudes sort of a serenity is the only other word I can think of, or the only word I can think of to describe it. That was just very surreal. I mean, is the only way I know how to put it. It felt very strange to be sitting here with this man who I know his history, I know what he has done, but the picture doesn't fit the history, if you know what I mean.
Here's a question for both of you: do you think, had he not gotten that ticket, how many more people would he have killed?
That's indeterminate, but certainly he would have kept going until he was stopped or until he aged out of it, which would be a long time.
I totally agree. Yeah, there's no way he was going to stop. And that Rob gets in one of the myths of serial killers, that they want to be captured. That they actually want to be apprehended.
The only one I can think of who ever fit that description was Ed Kemper, and none others.
Right, because his mission was completed at that point.
Exactly.
After he killed Mom. Mm-hmm. But most of them, they need it too much. They need to kill. This is something it's like you and I breathing. They need to kill. So why would they ever want to stop? Typically, it's because they make a mistake, they slip up somehow, they get sloppy in their work, and that's how they get caught. As with Berkowitz, but that's a myth that they want to get.
Go a little further with that. If you look at the letters he was writing, they became more and more illegible and more incoherent as he went along. And I think if an FBI or any other kind of profiler had been looking at those and studying them and talking to the police at that point and trying to advise them, they would have said, all right, he's going to get sloppy now because he is decompensating, as you can see from the letters. So let's try to get him to make a mistake.
And as far as, I know, and you guys can correct me, but the only serial killer that I know that's ever turned himself in was Wayne Adam Ford. He actually walked in. He actually walked in.
Kemper did too.
He did too.
Yeah, there have been a few, but it's the exception rather than the rule. Another thing that Berkowitz taught us is we've always thought, going back almost time immemorial, that killers return to the scene of their crime. But it was often thought, well, they did it out of a sense of remorse. But no, what we learned from Berkowitz and had this reconfirmed many, many times talking to serial killers and predators in prison since then is they go back to relive something, to enjoy it, to have the satisfaction again. Sometimes to even have sex with the dead bodies if the body is still there at the dump site.
Ted Bundy did that, and as did others. And it's because it's the domination and control. They don't want to give that up.
Absolutely true.
I've owned you once, and now I'm going to own you again.
Right. And in fact, I believe, and again, who knows how true this is or whether he actually believed it, Dennis Rader thought that all these women he killed, he then would possess them in heaven. That was part of the deal.
That's right. He said that in fact in court. He thought that they would serve him again.
Interesting. I mean, it's so beyond anything we can comprehend. That's what I think is so fascinating about these killers, is because people are trying to understand why they're doing the things they do, and you never really do. I mean, we can belabor it, but we can't really explain why he's done what he's done.
No, and the idea, I mean, just to think about it on a very basic level, the idea that someone could take it upon themselves to think it was okay, I mean, on whatever level you're talking about, that it was okay just to take another innocent life because you want to. And destroy other people's lives in the process. That is incomprehensible to those of us with any kind of conscience, and yet that's exactly what these people do.
That's so true. And the thing that again, it's a myth that's out there, is that they're all motivated by the same thing. They're one-trick ponies, and that sex is the primary motivation for all of them. And as you know, Mark, it's simply not true. There's so many different variations. The one thing that all serial killers have is, and if you can unlock this, then you really understand their pathology, is there's some fantasy need that is being served by the killing. And in the case of BTK, it was power, control, and domination of another human being. I believe for Berkowitz, it was the fact that he was looking for this purpose, looking to become a person of substance and power and meaning. And he thought that through killing for Satan, that somehow he would find it.
And I would also add to that the whole sense of resentment over his life.
Yes, absolutely. And so it's really, to understand any serial killer, you have to try to find that fantasy need that is being served. And in their minds, and here's where it becomes so insidious with an individual like BTK, they truly believe that it's beyond their control. Dennis Rader would even say, God made me this way. He made me the ultimate predator. So how can you condemn me? So they find even a useful rationalization for their own behavior. And
do you think, this is a hypothetical here, do you think if David Berkowitz didn't live in New York City and lived in a small town in Iowa, do you think he would have become Son of Sam? Because New York has a way of, it's got so much pressure. I mean,
also it certainly depersonalizes people.
Yeah,
like him.
You feel like
I think it would have been more difficult for him to commit these kind of crimes and get away with it. I mean, there'd be no sense of anonymity in a small town like that. And he wasn't crafty and a meticulous planner like Dennis Rader was. he didn't consider what he was doing art or projects, both of which were words that Dennis Rader used. And in fact, one of my more chilling experiences was after Rader was caught, and we had John and I had done a book. I think it was Obsession, but I don't remember exactly. Where we had this is before Rader was caught or identified, and we had done a crime based on Rader that we had some other purpose for. And Rader apparently read the book and annotated it as to which traits he thought fit him and which traits he didn't. So this was a guy who was even interested in his own psychic methodology.
Yeah. And David Berkowitz didn't have that. You said, like,
No, not at all.
Scott, and what do you think, planning wise, would he just go out, and then if he saw someone that looked like a potential victim, that he would do it? Or did he kind of plan
if it was the right location, which was kind of a secluded street where he would have a man and a woman in a car together, in a so-called lover's lane type place. So yeah, I think it was all opportunistic, and yet he told John that he, many times he was on the hunt nightly trying to find such a situation.
Yeah, and that's completely unlike BTK, who really planned.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Oh, not only
and and BTK would follow his victims for weeks, sometimes more. And BTK, my understanding was about the ropes and binding for him, but his real thrill was not physical torture as it was for some other people. It was the thrill of watching these people die by his hand. He would find a chair and sit and watch them die. That was what was important to him.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so twisted, but yes, he said at the moment that they died, he knew he was God. So that tells you everything you need to know about his motivation.
Absolutely.
It was all about the control of life and death, which was, again, very different than Berkowitz. And I totally agree. I think Berkowitz was an opportunistic killer. He was looking for the right situation and the right victim. I mean, he definitely seemed to be drawn to young women with dark hair.
Yes.
So there was
why is that?
victimology
Did he
there.
say why it was young, like the dark hair? Is there any kind of, did his mother have dark hair, or?
I don't know. A lot of it is just the way you are. I mean, Ted Bundy liked girls with long straight hair parted in the middle. I mean, I don't know where that came from, but that was his preference.
That's right. It's something that appealed to him, and which is, of course, what led to the frenzy in New York City of buying colorful wigs and women cutting their hair and dyeing their hair. And part of
and the other thing I'm sorry to interrupt. The other thing we can say, Scott, is look, those of us men who are attracted to women and women who are attracted to men, we all have preferential types. We can't necessarily tell you why, but these are people we want to know, we want to date, we want to marry. And in the case of these predators, they're people they want to kill.
Absolutely. I mean, there obviously was an attraction there. There was something, a sexual attraction to that type of victim.
Yeah, and that's kind of weird. You want to destroy your sexual attraction.
Well, you say destroy, but he would say possess.
Mm.
That's right.
Interesting.
And there's also certainly a sense of the same thing with the stalker mentality, which is if I can't have them physically, no one else can either.
For a moment, if we flip the script on the conversion and not question whether he became, a born-again Christian and is now devoted his life to God, but what about the folks? What about the individuals who have now created a website, ariseandshine.org, and see him as something of a, the living epitome of redemption? He has hundreds of thousands of people who come to this website now for his thinking and teachings. What do we make of all that?
Well, I think some of it is, as I say, redemption is a powerful narrative. So is notoriety. And when those two come together, I think you've got a certain type of person who figures, well, this is a person who's walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and so I'm going to listen to them. And then I think to a certain percentage, there's also this perverse fascination with somebody like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's probably, it's a healthy dose of both, I think.
Yeah.
And definitely he is aware of that attraction to him, because that's his message. And one of the last things he said to me when I left our meeting, our lunch together in prison, is he said, "Please tell everyone that if God can save a wretched soul like me, then no one is beyond redemption." So that's very much his narrative now.
And I'm also curious, Scott, was it easy to get him to talk to you, or did you have to go through a lot of convincing?
Well, it's interesting. He's only really wants to talk now about the Son of Hope, as I said. He doesn't want to talk about Son of Sam. So I initially wrote him a letter. I told him that I was a college professor and that I was very interested in learning about his thoughts on good and evil, and I appealed to the Son of Hope aspect of it. I said I'm very interested in your conversion and how you've changed, and he jumped on that immediately. I suspect that if I had simply said to him, "I'm only interested in your crimes. Why did you do it?" that he might not have, for lack of a better word, taken the bait.
Mm-hmm.
I find it interesting that he's still holding on to part of his branding of Son of Hope, Son of Sam, Son of Hope.
Yes, that's a very good point. He's reinvented himself and created a whole new persona for himself.
But he still wants the notoriety. That's why.
Exactly.
He's still
right.
he's like rebranding himself, but he still wants part of it.
Well, again, if he can get the sense of satisfaction and hero worship or whatever that he was trying to get through his crimes, if he can get that through his spirituality, that's probably fine for him.
And he loves being seen as the do-gooder now in prison. As I said, he would sit there and just beam as the young prisoners would come by and say, "Brother Dave, how are you, Brother Dave?" He would just sit there and beam. He loves facade, if you will, or persona that he's created for himself inside.
I mean, it's interesting, son of something. I mean, his mother rejected him, so it's interesting.
Yeah, that's another good point.
Son of somebody.
Yep.
So
that's right.
It's really rooted in that sense of when a mother rejects her child, this is what could happen. It's very disturbing.
Well, this has been fascinating, guys. This is fascinating. I'm trying to think of anything else that we want to cover here. It looks like we covered everything.
I think we have.
Yeah, I think we have.
Fantastic.
Always wonderful to get your insights on this, Mark.
Absolutely.
You too, Scott.
It's so lovely to speak to you, Mark. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Call me anytime.
All right. Thank you, guys. Next time on Partners in True Crime.
Oh, it was terrifying. People, again, they had no idea where this guy's going to strike, who is he going to strike. People were saying, okay, yeah, all his victims had long, dark hair, the women. Well, probably three-quarters of the female population had that. And so, of course, they were all terrified. His last victim, Stacy Moskowitz, was a blonde.
We have an exciting announcement for all of our listeners. Doc Bonn is taking his serial killer expertise on the road this spring in a live theater event.
To purchase tickets to Doc Bonn's show, The Psychology of Serial Killers and Why They Captivate Us, go to www.psychologyofserialkillers.com. That's www.psychologyofserialkillers.com. Go see Doc Bonn and get the real story on what goes on in these notorious killers' minds.
All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.